All right, guys, the moment you've all been waiting for is finally here. We're working on authentication for our Laravel application. So, for those of you guys just joining in, this is part 26 of how to build a blog with Laravel. We're working with Laravel 5.2, and we're kind of starting for all beginners. We're starting from the very beginning and working our way up to this point in the application. We've been working on CRUD for our controllers. We've built a pretty solid blogging application up to this point, and now it's time to lock it down with authentication, where we let users basically log in with a username and a password. We're going to authenticate them using the learning to use the built-in authentication class in Laravel, and then we're finishing up with the last few things, and this series is done. So I know everyone's really excited to get started with this authentication, and so I'm really excited to give it to you. For those of you guys just joining in, you guys can try to follow along. We'll have source code linked down in the description. And you may want to go back to the beginning of the playlist, which is also in the description, to watch everything up to this point, because we've had quite a bit of tutorials up until this point. But anyway, for those of you guys that have been waiting, the authentication is finally here. Let's go ahead and get started, and let's have some fun with this. All right, so real quick before we get started, I want to kind of set the stage for this authentication. A lot of people have been sending me requests about authentication. I think it's great. I love it. Feel free to email me at any time. You can email me hello@jacurtis.com or hit me up on Twitter @_JACurtis, so JACURTIS. All right, so where are we going with this authentication? Well, let's first open up. I'm going to open up our project in Sublime and do all that kind of stuff, because I want to kind of show you guys what we're doing, what we're not doing, because everyone's been asking me to do lots of features, and I think it's great, but I'm not going to hit every single feature, just because some of the stuff you guys are asking is outside of the scope of this tutorial. So while I want to make sure I give you guys what you want, I also do want to, I'm kind of trying to control it to make sure that it fits in with the parameters that I originally set up with this tutorial series, okay? And so some of the stuff you guys were asking is definitely going to be outside the scope of this beginner series. However, what I'm going to do is, because it's in such high demand, and I remember learning authentication just a while, I guess it was a while ago, but I remember learning authentication and really couldn't find any good tutorials out there. So I want to be able to provide that for you guys. So even if I don't address some of the complex, the more advanced features of authentication in this tutorial, what we're going to do is, as soon as this series is done, which we're getting kind of to the end of it, we're wrapping down with a few last features, but as soon as this series is done, I'm going to do a mini series right after this about authentication in Laravel, and we'll do an advanced authentication series. So we're going to hit up things that we don't do in this series. We're going to do roles, which roles are like if you have an admin and then like someone who's not an admin but has a lot of power, and then maybe just a peon that doesn't have any power. Different levels of they call it roles, basically. I don't know how else to describe it. We're going to work on roles. We'll do social authentication, like logging in with Twitter or Facebook or something like that. We'll do I think we will do password resets in this video, so that'll be good. But we'll do some more like confirming your account. We'll do in the advanced one. What else? I'll remember them as we get to them. Some of the stuff that we won't be hitting up in this tutorial that people have been asking about. And the reason is because what I'm teaching you in this tutorial is the built-in Laravel, authentication. Okay, so that's what I'm going to show you. So let me open up the project real quick. We're going to go into our blog, and let's open it up. Okay, so here inside of our project, you remember when we first started working on this project that we had under our apps and in our controllers. Oh, come on. There we go. In our controllers, we had a controller. Did we not have a controller for authentication? Oh, it's down here. It's a model for it. There's not a controller, I guess, for authentication, but there is a model for authentication. And here's the model for authentication. And then I guess we're going to create the controller today. And then, here's the authentication. I was going to say, I thought there was an authentication controller. It's under a folder called auth. So we've already got an authentication controller. What we're going to do is work with this existing authentication controller and this existing user model, and then the existing migrations. Okay, so these three things together basically set up the built-in Laravel authentication. Okay, so while you still have to do a little work to get the authentication to work, it's pretty easy to do, and that's what we're going to be doing in this series. Okay, now if we want to do advanced salts and hashes and stuff like that, that's outside of the scope of this tutorial. We need to, there's a lot of like theory that we have to talk about to really fully understand how to salt and hash your passwords and stuff like that. Laravel does all that behind the scenes, luckily. So we're going to take advantage of some of the Laravel magic and let Laravel handle some of the complex stuff. And we're just going to learn how to tie it into our application. Okay, so that's what this is about. Creating an authentication from scratch is coming in a future video series, okay? Not part of this series, but like we're gonna finish up this blog series, and then we'll do a mini series that's only authentication, and we'll do some advanced authentication stuff. So today you're gonna learn how to tie in the built-in Laravel authentication, and then in the next one, we're gonna do the advanced Laravel authentication. And I do want to kind of teach you guys how to build it from scratch, because even if you don't end up using a built-in from scratch one, seeing how all the parts work is like huge in understanding what's happening behind the scenes, because sometimes these feel magical and I hate not understanding what's going on behind the scenes. And so if you're the same way, I do want to show you guys how to build it yourself, just so you know what's happening behind the scenes. Okay. All right. So let's get started. Let's start by looking at what's built into Laravel right now, and then let's tie this in to make it work with our application. Okay. So as we mentioned, we've got our authentication controller. Okay, in this folder called auth, we have an authentication controller. This is the base authentication controller. This comes with if you install Laravel 5 or 5.2, I think they have changed it a little bit. Like Laravel 5 and Laravel 5.1, I think, had a slightly different authentication system than Laravel 5.2. They changed it again. Laravel 5.2 is a pretty big change. I don't know why they didn't just make it Laravel 6, but they didn't. Okay, so authentication controller or auth controller here is everything that's going to be built into Laravel. This is basically what they give us to get started, and this is a very basic authentication system. It's going to allow us to have an email. It's going to allow us to have a password for each user, and then we can store a name. All right. It doesn't differentiate first name, last name. It's just going to do first name. It's just going to do name and then email, password. And this corresponds with a migration that Laravel already set up for us. So let's go take a look at the migrations real fast. You guys know where those are. They're going to be under database, and then migrations. And then the first two migrations here, the ones dated in 2014, those are the ones that you're going to look at. So the first migration here is, and you can look here, it's for creating the users table. And you can see here, since you guys know all about authentication, or you already know about migrations, you know how to read these documents now, which we didn't before, which is why I skipped over it when we first got to it, was because you guys didn't understand migrations yet. And now that you guys do, we can come back and learn about them, okay? So on the up function, you can see that we create a users table, pretty basic. In that table, we've got obviously our ID. We got to have that, primary ID. Then we create a string for a name. This is a varchar, remember? So this is for your name column. Then you have a column for your email. This email is unique. We just learned about that in the last couple videos ago when we did, I don't remember. Whatever we were doing, we made it unique. I don't remember now. Anyway, so there we had the emails, and then we've got our password. You can see our password's limited to 60 characters. And that's because it's going to be what they call hashed. And so when it gets hashed, it's going to get hashed down and become 60 characters. Okay, so then we've got a remember token. Now, this remember token is something that if we want to go back to the Laravel documentation for migrations, we looked at this really briefly. I remember pointing it out at one point. Basically, this is a special column name. Laravel knows how to handle these remember tokens, and it basically just knows that this is the column for remember tokens. And remember tokens are when you click remember me, and it obviously remembers you. That's a remember token. It stores that in the database, a special hash unit that gets stored in this column in the database. And then when you try to log back in, it's going to match a cookie that you have on your computer with a hash value in the database column, okay? So once it matches those two up, then it's like, oh, we automatically know who you are. That's how the remember me works. That's why if you clear out your cookies, you like on your computer, you're no longer going to be remembered on these systems anymore when you go to websites, because that's how the remember me works. Basically, it creates a cookie with a really long random hash value in it, and then it takes that same value, stores it into a column in the database, this remember me token column, and stores it there. And then when you come onto the website will check to see if you have a cookie, a remember cookie on your computer, if you is for that domain and everything. And if you do, it'll take the value in that cookie and try to find someone in the database that has that value, okay? Now, if you're building this from scratch, it's important to remember that you do encrypt it and all the cookie and everything like that, because you don't want anything from a security standpoint, you don't want anything stored in a cookie that would allow them to log in as someone else, okay? That's why having long hashed values make it nearly impossible to be able to do this type of logged in thing, but still possible. So you got to remember that as a security concern. Anyway, that's what remember me is a special column name. The last thing here is timestamps. So you guys already know about timestamps, but we want to create it at and update it at. Timestamp in our database. You guys know how that works. Don't need to explain it. Okay, that's our database for our users. Now we also have another migration down here, and if we take a look at that, this is a password resets migration. It creates a table called password resets, very original, and then 2 varchar columns, email and token, and then the timestamp. Once again, talking about real quick what's happening in this is when you click forgot my password, the way this works is you're going to type in an email address into a form, and we'll set up all these forms as views so that we can control what you're seeing. But basically, when you click forget my password, it takes you to a view on the website. In that view, it's got a single form field. It asks for your email. You type in your email. When you click submit, it's going to obviously go to the controller. You guys know that. And the controller is then going to take that email value, look for someone in the database that has that email. It's going to match it up. It's going to create an item in this password resets column with that email address, and it's going to give it a random token, okay? Send them off an email with a URL that incorporates that random token that's stored in the database. And then when you click that link in your email, it takes you back to the website. And just like the remember me functionality that I just talked about, where you're taking the cookies long hash value and matching it up to a database hash value, that's kind of the security aspect of remember me. You're doing the same thing, similar thing here, where basically when you click that link to reset your password, it's going to compare that token with the token that's in the URL to the token that's in the database in this column here. If those both match up, then it's going to say, okay, you're valid, you're allowed to reset your password, and then it's going to give you 2 fields to reset your password. The security of this is basically knowing that you own that email address. So if you sign up with an email address on this website, and now you're resetting your password, basically the only people that would have access to this token is whoever owns the email address, because they would have or has access to the email address. Because then they have to get that token through their email. Okay, so that's kind of the security aspect of resetting your password, and that prevents me from going to your account and just resetting your password yourself. Because if I clicked forgot your password, put in your email address, I wouldn't be able to get this secret token. I wouldn't be able to get because it's sent to your email address. Okay, so I would have to have access to your email account. Then I could click it, and and then it compares the two, and that's how it basically. That's the security way, the security measure it uses to allow people to reset their password. So that's what's happening when you reset your password. And then when you submit so basically at that point, once it validates your token to the email token, you're going to get a second view that you're looking at that's going to have the new password that you want to set up. You're going to type in your new password, submit the form one more time. That's going to go back to a controller. The controller is going to then update that password to the password item for this email. Okay, so it's going to take that email, go over to your users column, find the email column, and then update the password column with your new password. Obviously, it's going to hash the password up or encrypt it, whatever you want to call it. We haven't talked about hashing and salting yet, but hashing and salting is a process that happens in authentication. That's basically how you make the password secure. You never store database in authentication systems. You never store raw passwords in the database. Why? Because if someone ever got access to your database, someone hacked your AWS account, or they found a way to get into your database, they would have access to every single person's passwords. So you do some little tricky methods. We call them you hash it, which is kind of a quick encryption method to randomize it into a bunch of characters. And then hashes can be easily unhashed. So you also salt it, which is adding another random thing, what they call a salt. You add a random thing to the password as well that only you know about. And that way you can easily unencrypt it because you know this secret thing. But if you didn't know that secret thing, it would be really hard to unencrypt it. That's the general idea. We'll talk about that when we build our own in the advanced authentication system. We'll go into more detail about that, and we'll have a whole video talking about hashing and salting passwords. The good thing you need to know for this is that all that happens behind the scenes. All the hashing and salting is happening behind the scenes. So you just know that what's being stored in the database is a secure password hash. Okay, so it's salted, it's hashed, and that value is what's stored in the database. When we go to actually do the remember me, which we're going to do here in a second, we actually try to compare the password that you put in when you tried to log in to the password in the database. Laravel's automatically going to do the hashing and salting and compare the two and give us the value, whether it's true or false. So it makes our jobs really, really easy because Laravel's done a lot of the hard work. Okay? All right, so we have these two migrations here. And with these two migrations, we have two tables now that account for our authentication. Let's take a look because we've already migrated these. If you're just jumping on and you're not doing anything up to this point that we've done in our project, in order to take advantage of these tables before you do anything else, before you start working in the controllers and stuff that we're about to do, you need to migrate these into your database because you need access to this information, you need a place to store it, and so forth. So what you would do is you would do PHP artisan migrate. Now, if I run PHP artisan migrate, there's nothing to migrate because we've already done it. But again, if you're just booting up a Laravel application for the first time and you've never migrated it, you would want to go do this PHP artisan migrate. This pushes these migrations that we're looking at right here onto the database to actually create it in the database. We've already done it. So if you want to, you can go ahead and do PHP artisan migrate. If you see nothing to migrate, you're good to go. And if you migrate, then you've migrated and now you're good to go. Okay, now let's go over and we're going to open up just something to look at our database. You can do this however you want. I'm using SQL Pro and we're just going to boot into our database here. You guys know the drill. We're going to blog and we've got our three tables. We've looked at this before. This is nothing new. We created this all by hand, our post table. You guys know that. And then we've largely ignored these other tables. I think I did talk about one point, the migrations table is just a way to, that Laravel keeps track of what it's migrated and what it hasn't migrated. So these are all the migrations, and this tells it, these all did them at once in one batch. But it just helps it keep track of, like, if you need to roll back a migration, it knows the order these were migrated in and stuff like that. Okay. That's what migrations are, so you can basically ignore it. Don't touch it. Let Laravel handle migrations. We're going to deal with password resets and users. Okay, so let's just take a quick gander at users. And in users, you can see that we've got, it's just going to match everything we did in our migration. So we've got our ID, we've got our name, our email, password, our member token. If we come over here to structure, you can see a little bit more about it. So you can see that the ID is a primary integer, 10 lengths, it auto increments, it's a primary key. And then you can also see here the name is a varchar, goes up to 255, which is the maximum for our varchar. You guys should know that. And then you also can see the email's a varchar 255, and it's got a unique key. Okay, so down here we've got our indexes. In our indexes, you can see the primary keys are indexed, and you can also see that the email accounts are indexed. This shouldn't be a surprise because we're going to be using the emails to find. That's going to be basically our username, okay? So you're going to type in your username or your email address, and that's how we're going to find that person in the database. So we're going to search really quick to that email address and see if it matches. And that's why we need to have that indexed, is so that we can, first of all, make sure that it's unique. We don't want two people in there with the same email address, because then how do we authenticate them? We can't. So they've got to be unique. Second of all, we need to have it indexed so we can access it quickly, so that we can quickly find you in your account. And then we're going to be able to compare your password, which is down here, to the password you entered. We also need to be doing, we're going to actually be accessing this database almost every page request, because every single page request, we're going to see if you're logged in or not. And then, so we're going to have to search that database really fast after every page request. You also might pull user information like their name, or there might be other, if you expanded out this model a little bit, you might have other information in there as well. It might have someone's birth date or something like that. And so we're going to access this a lot. And so that's why we need to have emails easily accessible. That's what we're going to use to find people. We're probably not going to use the IDs very much. We're going to use the emails. Okay. So that's what we did there. And then we've got a remember me password. This remember me token, it's a varchar again, 100 characters. It allows null, which means that it can have no value, obviously. So it can be blank. And the default is null. So basically, if you're not ever remembering me, then you won't have, it'll just delete it and there won't be anything in this remember me column. And that's how we know that you are basically, you're on like a whatever. You're not going to be remembered. Okay, created that, updated that. You guys know the drill there. Those are timestamps and they allow null. Okay, that's what we got there. And then password resets we just looked at. Email, password, both varchars 255. And it looks like they're both actually, yep, they're both indexed. So you've got the email columns indexed, the token columns indexed. So it can find quickly based on either value. All right, perfect. We're done here. We're done looking at the database. We know how it works. I think you guys can see now what we're going to do to store information. We're going to be able to store their name. We're going to store their email address here, their password, and so forth. We're going to leave remember me for a couple videos from now. We'll do that at the end of the authentication. And that's all we've got there. Now let's go ahead and let's just take a look at our controller. Let's run through our controller. I know we're doing a lot of, we're not actually moving through, but it's because we have to fully understand authentication. A lot of this has been built for us. And so I just want to go through and review what's been built for us before we pull the trigger or anything. Okay. That's why I'm doing a lot of talking and we're not actually doing much. Okay. Here's our authentication controller. For those of you guys that missed out at the beginning, just in case you're just catching up now. So under your controllers, there's a folder called auth, and then the authentication controllers in the auth folder, okay? We have another controller for password resets, which we'll just deal with in a bit. Okay, so we're just gonna look at the auth controller right now. Okay, so in our auth controller, you can see that we're pulling in our user model. So we'll take a look at our user model in a second. We're pulling in a validator, the validator class. You guys already know about the validator class. And then we already, obviously, controllers. We have another, there's this special contract here called it's throttle logins, which we'll address in a few videos. But throttle logins is basically a way, Laravel's got it built in, where you can actually control how often someone's allowed to try to log in. So you can basically say every 30 minutes, no more than 3 attempts on the single email account or something like that. So Laravel's already built the code to do that, and we're pulling it in, so we have access to it here. We're not going to do that in the video, but we will in a few videos. Okay, so and the last thing here is authenticate and register users, which is basically, that's kind of the authentication engine, okay? So this is just the controller that we look at, but this authenticate and registers users is what actually is like doing a lot of that's the backbone of the authentication system, and this is stored in basically the source code for Laravel. Okay, that's what's happening here. Now you can see that we've got our auth controller, we extend controller, we have access to all the controller stuff. You guys know that. This should be a review. And let's see. Okay, now what we're dealing with down here is if you want to customize your controller a little bit. So, for example, we haven't set up routes. We're going to do that here in just a minute or two. That's the next thing we're going to do. But basically, you can choose where to redirect users after logins and registrations by default. So if someone's logging into their system, where do you want to take them at the beginning? Do you want to take them to the root of their website? Do you want to take them to like a dashboard account or to my account page or whatever? You can customize that here as the redirect to. Now we don't have a home, this /home, we don't have that in our routes. That might cause problems because what's going to happen is as soon as we log in, it's going to redirect us to this /home, and there's no /home route set up. We're going to come back to this though because I don't really have anything else set up to be better. We could just have it be / right now, and we'll just do that. So we'll just have it be / right now, and that'll just take us to the home page of the website. Okay, but that's where you can control this. You can overwrite where it redirects to on your after they log in. Okay, so now looking down here, we've got the construct. So we're going to be working more with constructs now, which I don't think I've addressed up to this point. Constructs are just a PHP class thing. They're just part of PHP, not specifically Laravel. And construct is what runs every time you make an you instantiate a class. Okay, an instantiation is basically when you it's like when you create a new object via a class. Okay, like with a class, you're creating a new object, you're instantiating a new object. Is the way it works. Every time you instantiate an object, you go through the construct method. Okay, by default, even if you don't have one here, it looks for a construct method. This is just something built into Laravel, or built into PHP, I mean. And so you can put whatever you want whenever a new object's created. If you want to run something, you throw it in the construct method, because you know it always runs before anything else in a class. Okay, so in this case, since our controller is just a class, we can actually set things that happen every time we instantiate the class in the construct method. We're going to be using this for a few other things, but the perfect example here is where they set the middleware. So they're saying basically anything in this class is going to run under the middleware of guest. Okay, so that's a middleware already created by Laravel. We're going to run that middleware every time we do anything in this class. So that's saying that basically everything here in this controller, it goes through the guest middleware. Okay, the guest middleware, other than the log out. So if they do the log out through this class, that does not go through the guest middleware. Okay, the guest middleware is basically the authentication middleware. Okay, that's what's happening here under the construct, just because I think that's confusing for people. But for the most part, just think about it. The real power is it's pointing to the middleware. That's really what's happening. If you want questions about it, you want to go look at the middleware first. Next, we've got our validator. Okay, so the validator is for any incoming registration request. So we're going to go look at where this points in a second, because the logic isn't happening in this controller. It's actually happening up here in this authenticates and registers users. However, the validator allows us to override some of the stuff. Whenever you see this protected, by the way, these are usually this is information that the classes need, and we're usually overriding them in Laravel, because we can pull, these are normally set in the source code, and then we can pull them into our controllers, or the controllers basically, and override them ourselves. So we're overriding the validator information. And this just sets basically how we validate data. So by default, we've got a name, an email, a password. If you had a first name and a last name in your database, you would basically do that here. You would say, okay, well, if we have a first name, so you would set up your first name, and this is where you would tell Laravel that you've added other stuff in your database and that it needs to be aware of them. So then you would also have your last name, and then you could set last name whatever authentication it needed. So, you could do required 255 because it's a varchar. Okay, so that's what we're doing here. We're going to go ahead and just undo that because we don't need it, but I just wanted to show you guys that if you were adding something, that's where you would be adding it, is here. So you want to make sure it validates. Laravel basically tells Laravel that it exists or to expect it. The one thing Laravel's always requiring, though, is this email and a password or some sort of username field. So if you had a username, you could change it to be other than email, and I'll show you that in a little bit as well. Okay, last thing is create, and this is if you're creating a new user. This is basically, again, Laravel's doing the create behind the scenes. This allows you to override it. So if you were doing a first name and a last name, you would want that in here. If you were setting roles, you would want that in here. You would basically just change it here. Okay, so that's what you're going to do. All right, so that's our authentication controller. That's what's happening right now. We don't really need to customize it. We can actually just leave it the way it is, and we can take advantage of all the stuff that's built into it. Really quick, we're going to move over to authenticates and registers users, take a look at that so we know what's happening behind the scenes, and then we're going to throw it into the application. So what I'm going to do, because we're going to ignore password controller right now because we're not going to reset password. We will, but we're not going to in this video. We'll address it when we get everything else working. Okay, let's head on over to Illuminate Foundation Authentication. For those of you guys who don't know, it's buried pretty deep. You need to come down here to Vendor, and then we're going to look up Laravel, Framework, Source, Illuminate, Foundation, Auth, and then Authenticates and Registers Users. So it's this file right here. Okay, here you can see that it basically uses authenticates users, registers users. Okay, so we can look at authenticates and registers users, and these two are going to be what we're using. So authenticates is what allows us, like when you're actually logging in, it goes through this authenticates users control. It's basically a controller. It's just a class, but it gets inherited into the controller. So it becomes part of our controller. And then registers users is when you're creating a new user. So that's what this goes through registering or creating new users. So let's just take a look at this registers users real quick. You can see here that it's grabbing the registration form. This is the registration form down here. This is where you can tweak some of this information. We're not going to do much in this tutorial, but this is where you would do it. And you can kind of see here where it works. So if the validator fails, it throws the exception. It uses this first class we have, auth guard, which is basically saying prevent them from accessing it. And it's going to redirect them to a login. So this is what's happening when they try to register and it fails. So you guys can kind of read through this on your own on your own time, but I wanted to show you guys where you find the meat of authentication that's built in if you want to study how Laravel does it, okay? What I'm going to do, I'm over here now back at Authenticates users to take a look at that. So you got your login form, and you can see here that where it's looking for the login form. We're going to create that here right now, but you can see basically where it works. Here's the login. So here's how it logs in. You can see it's looking for throttles and everything like that. You can learn a lot about authentication by looking at some of this code here. Of course, I don't want to go through all of it, but I just wanted to show you guys, where it works. So you can see here how it handles failed requests and everything, okay? There's logout, there's middleware, everything. All right, so that sums up everything I wanted to go over in this video. This video was a preparatory video to kind of get you set up and comfortable with Laravel, with kind of the files that Laravel uses for authentication, okay? So now you're ready, you're prepared, you understand how Laravel works, where the authentication files come from, how you make changes and all that kind of stuff. So the next video, we'll start creating the views and the routes for our files. And then we can move on to actually, using kind of the API that is built into Laravel for managing authentication, okay? So thanks for sticking in here. I know this might have not been the most exciting episode, but it's really going to be helpful as you move forward with authentication, understanding how all the pieces connect together, and being able to see the inner guts of Laravel is going to be a huge advantage for you moving forward. So I wanted to take some time to go over it myself. So anyway, thanks for sticking in here, guys. Again, the next video, we're actually going to start writing code. We're going to create the routes and then the views for our authentication. I'll see you guys there.